Well, hello, everybody, and it looks like we are finally live. So, welcome to the Sunday stream of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about one of my favorite musicians of all time, the inimitable, the legendary, the virtuoso Eddie Van Halen. Now, it's kind of hard to talk about him on a day like this in some ways because for decades of a long and fruitful musical career, he brought audiences around the world pure happiness. But it was on this day in 2020 that he made us cry for the first time ever. And it really came out of the blue. So I want to talk about what it was like on that day in 2020, learning that he died. 2020 was a really bad year for a lot of people. For many people watching this stream, it might be the worst year of their life for many reasons. Um, the world went nuts. It was just, I don't need to reprise what happened in 2020. If you're over 4 years old, you know all too well what happened. Um, and it was when the year was nearing its end in October, when we could have used a bit of good news. And all of a sudden, I remember it like it was yesterday. The news came out that Eddie Van Halen had died. And it was known that he was sick for a while. He had had cancer and was in various treatments for it on and off since the early 2000s, but he looked great, at least in the videos that we saw of him. There was a video shot not too long before his death when he took Wolf to a concert. I think it was a Foo Fighters concert. It was one of the bands that were obviously younger than Van Halen. And one of the fans in the audience asked Wolf's dad, "Will you take a picture of me and my friends?" Not knowing that Wolf's dad was more famous and sold more records than the guys on stage. So that was one of these sort of fun generation gap types of things. And it was only in 2015 that Van Halen had their final tour, which by all means was a success. Eddie was playing as good as ever. He was looking great. And the secret about just how ill he had become in around 2019, it was pretty well hidden from everyone. Both Sammy Hagar and Michael Anthony said that they knew he was ill, but they thought that he was, getting better and that with all the ups and downs that entails, but no one really knew. Alex said nothing. Alex never really gives interviews apart from his brother anyway, and Wolf wasn't saying anything at that time. Wolf at that time wasn't really giving many interviews. That has obviously changed a lot in the last 4 years. And so we got the news. And it was one of those things where there's some people, irrespective of how old they are, that just sort of seem eternally young because of what they did. And to see Eddie on stage, he was always smiling. He was always having a good time. Whether or not he was the easiest person to work with has been debated, and those debates will go on. But when he was in the moment playing his music on stage with his brother and their band, he was smiling from ear to ear. And you can't fake that. He loved playing music. He lived and breathed music from a young age because it was all he knew. He comes from a genuine musical family. His father was a professional musician, and he and his brother kind of figured out without having to say it that from a young age they would follow in his footsteps. And one of the stories that I just love is that when Jan, their father, Jan Van Halen, was playing at various jazz gigs across LA, because he was a jazz clarinetist and played other instruments as well, that he would often deputize his young kids and make them members of the band when someone didn't show up. And there were some instances when you had Eddie playing jazz guitar in his father's band and you had Alex back there on the drums. We all know the story of when they were very young. Eddie was supposed to be the drummer, Alex was supposed to be the guitar player, but they were better at each other's instruments, and so they swapped, and the rest, as they say, is history. What made Eddie Van Halen, though, so special? In an age where there was a lot of good music on FM radio, why was Van Halen dominant even among the highly popular acts of the time? And I think that it goes beyond Eddie's virtuosity. I think it all comes down to the fact that Eddie Van Halen was one of the best songwriters of all time. His riffs, the songs as a whole, the structure of the songs, the chords, the way that the solos existed both apart and yet detached simultaneously from the sort of chordal structure of the song. All of that made him a wonderful songwriter. And if he wrote those songs for someone else, they would have still been hits. Maybe not as big, because the way he played his music was, of course, supremely integral. But to me, people frankly focus too little on just what a good songwriter he was. There's no such thing as a dud on any Van Halen album. Forget singles, they never once released a bad single. But I defy you to find any song on any album that is bad. Okay, there were a few novelty songs on Diver Down. That was Dave's input. But on the songs that Eddie truly had his stamp on, which was, 99.999% of all Van Halen songs, find me a bad one. There just aren't any. And when you combine that with guitar playing that gets your attention and yet is easy on the ear, then you've got something. People talk about a brown sound. People love to obsess over the equipment, but as a lot of other guitar players will tell you, and I think it was Joe Satriani who actually said this, but others have said it too. The people, some guitar players and some musicians of all kinds, really do let the equipment define their sonic texture, the quality of their sound. And there's nothing wrong with that, because the integration of technology in music has been the story of music for at least 200 years. I kind of sort of did a video on that yesterday. But Eddie Van Halen, you could plug him into anyone's amp, even on someone else's guitar with someone else's effects pedals, and it still sounded like Eddie Van Halen. And that to me is what was and will always be so special about the sound of Eddie Van Halen. And in terms of the virtuosity, in terms of what he was doing with his hands, he did stuff with the guitar that was really unknown in the rock world and in many ways unknown in any different school of the guitar. Every generation has their sort of iconic guitarist or guitarists. The 60s, you've got Jimi Hendrix and you've got Eric Clapton in the rock world. In the jazz world, it was a decade that began with people like Wes Montgomery and Grant Green, and it ended with people like John McLaughlin. In the 70s, you had so many guitar heroes. You had Robin Trower on the blues side, Ernie Isley on the soul side, Jimmy Page on the rock side. So many great ones. Steve Howe and Steve Hackett on the progressive rock side, Al Di Meola on the jazz side, Coryell, Larry Coryell on the jazz side, one of the greatest ever. And I'm just naming some of the ones that were really big, because there were so many great musicians of all instruments in both jazz and rock and soul in the 70s. But I'm just naming some of the ones that tend to really stick out. It's not meant to be at the expense of anyone. And then along comes Eddie Van Halen at the end of the 70s. Even though he had been playing professionally since 1974, he turned pro when he was still in high school. And it was in 78 when the world got to hear the first Van Halen album. And it was just one of those albums. I know this sounds cliche, but let me put it this way. Yes, we're a great one of my favorite bands in the 70s, but there came a point where every Yes album had a similar format and a similar sound. It was just, what interesting compositions by these great writers of music am I going to hear? Look at a more sort of popular, sort of mainstream rock band like the Eagles. It wasn't that Hotel California was so stylistically different than the stuff that came before it. It was, again, great songwriting, a really good song. But with Van Halen's first album in 78, it was more than just really good songs, even though it was that. And as I said, that is an integral reason behind why Van Halen was so successful. It sounded different. And it's kind of hard to define. So, for instance, if you were to compare Deep Purple to Slayer, 8 people out of 10 will say, "Oh, Slayer sounds harder. It sounds rougher." Okay, I think that's a valid description. If someone were to compare the, let's say, the genesis of the 70s with the genesis of the 80s, they'd say, "Oh, the 80s genesis is a bit more poppy, somewhat more danceable." And that would be one way of describing that. But words kind of fail when it comes to describing how Van Halen was different. Because on the one hand, it was the classic rock and roll format. Let's put together an album of great songs and play the hell out of them. But the sound was so fresh. It was in your face, but without being aggressive. It was virtuosic, but never at the expense of the songwriting. On the contrary, the virtuosity and the songwriting were integral. And that, if you remember anything about, at my opinion, of Eddie Van Halen, it is that. What else made it unique? The humor, and a lot of that came from the lyrics. And Eddie's serious guitar, but his big smile, and David Lee Roth's sort of tongue-in-cheek vaudevillian lyrics, it made a statement. And the other thing that was so important is that there were no bad musicians in the band. Of course, Eddie, as this virtuosic guitar player who, in the words of Frank Zappa, reinvented the electric guitar and made it relevant again. Alex was a great drummer. The only reason we don't hear more about him is because his brother took the limelight. Alex was always cool with that. They fought about other stuff, like very close siblings do, but Alex knew that it was kind of Eddie's band, and they loved each other from day one, even when they were fighting. They were, typical brother relationship. Michael Anthony, talk about an unsung hero, which is ironic because he's probably one of the most famous backing vocalists in rock. But his bass playing, we don't hear enough about it. He was a really good bass player. And when he was allowed to go wild, the way he did, for instance, when they were covering The Who's Won't Get Fooled Again, because that was a band with a lead virtuosic bass player who was a shy man, but sonically he stole that spotlight. And you can really hear how Michael Anthony really goes to town. But he knew that his main role in Van Halen was to really create the bottom end of a sound led by the really sort of trebly and mid-rangey guitar of Eddie Van Halen. And that really worked well together. And of course, there are sort of two chapters of the Van Halen band, and people always argue about them. When Sammy Hagar came in '85, I would say that musically the band got even more sophisticated because Sammy's got a much wider vocal range. What they lost in the dance routines and the humor, they gained a musician with frankly a better voice, and someone who was a very respectable guitar player himself. Sammy understood music. He understood, okay, if we do this song in this key, and if it starts here and ends here, we'll be able to do that. And so Eddie found sort of another melodic ally, if you will, in the band. And the music went from strength to strength. They kept dominating FM radio throughout North America. The shows got bigger, the albums kept selling, and that isn't easy. Not many bands can switch singers in the middle of the career. We talk a lot in the music press world, because I guess that's what this is, about Journey, who in the sort of in the part of their career after which the biggest hits were made, they changed singers from the legendary Steve Perry, and eventually settled on Arnel Pineda. We've talked about him, but I'm talking about bands that switch singers in the height of their career. You can look at the Doobie Brothers in a way, when Michael McDonald came in and he changed the sound, but they went from strength to strength. You could look at Genesis, who we mentioned earlier, when Peter Gabriel went solo and Phil Collins stepped in. They went from strength to strength. And we can look at Van Halen, when David Lee Roth, some say he was fired, some say he quit. We will never know. And Sammy Hagar came in, and they didn't lose a step. Now, why is that? Well, there's two reasons. One, Sammy's a great musician and great vocalist, but the other reason why the Van Halen name and the Van Halen sound was able to remain pretty damn consistent was because of that great songwriting and that great virtuosic playing. And Eddie was someone who, again, some say he wasn't easy to work with, but that didn't mean he was ungenerous. He was incredibly generous. And I can give you just two examples. Alan Holdsworth, in the jazz fusion world, is considered by many the best guitar player of all time. Think what Eddie Van Halen did to rock and popular guitar, Alan Holdsworth did to jazz fusion and, dare we say, avant-garde guitar. Now, Alan was pretty much downright antisocial at times. That doesn't mean he wasn't a good guy, but uh, he was talk about not easy to get along with. I'll put it that way. And Eddie moved mountains to try to get Holdsworth a U.S. record deal. Things were difficult, but Eddie's stamp of approval on Alan's playing did get a lot of people in the music world and guitar fanatics, guitar players to pay attention to him. The even bigger example of his personal generosity has to do with his friendship with Dweezil Zappa, Frank's eldest son. And Dweezil was a guitar player whose style in the 80s was very much influenced by Eddie Van Halen. And there are so many wonderful stories about the two of them. There's the story that Dweezil recently told Rick Beato about the first time he met Eddie. Eddie called up Frank's house. Frank wasn't really sure who it was because, I mean, imagine having a phone book in the 70s and being able to prank call Frank Zappa. Fun times. It was before the world of TikTok. So Frank wasn't sure. So he said, Dweezil, see, because Dweezil was really into that. I said, that's Eddie, yeah. So they ended up talking, and Eddie, who just lived in the same part of LA, Hollywood Hills, Laurel Canyon area, he came over, and Dweezil talks about how they jammed in Frank's studio, the Utility Muffin Kitchen. And this relationship led to Eddie producing Dweezil's first single called My Mother is a Space Cadet, and he even plays a bit of guitar on it. It was engineered by Don Landy, the longtime engineer of Van Halen, who helped to build Eddie's 5150 studios in the mid 80s. And so that relationship continued. There was another great story I love about when Dweezil was playing guitar in his school talent show. And I think his father was out on tour, and his amp broke just before they were about to play. So Eddie brought over his rig, and you had must have been a 15 or 16-year-old Dweezil Zappa at a school talent show playing on the rig of Eddie Van Halen, which was very fun for Dweezil, as he'll tell you. And of course, when Frank died, the very first person to call Dweezil was Eddie. So that friendship remained very close throughout their lives. And Dweezil was the first person to write an open letter to Wolf when Eddie died. So there's definitely that generous side of Eddie. And as you know, when people play in bands, there is definitely friction. Now, speaking of which, later this month, it's October, obviously, because October the 6th is when Eddie died in 2020. And a bit later this month, Alex is coming out with his first ever book, which is interesting because Alex has always been the least vocal of anyone in Van Halen. He would do interviews with his brother, and he had a sense of humor. The two of them were always going back and forth. It was very funny, but I can't really recall maybe any more than a handful of interviews that he ever did without Eddie. And I can't remember any interviews he ever did without other members of the band. So he's the shy one in terms of sort of public relations. So when his book comes out later this month, it will be really interesting to see what's in there. It's called Brothers, and it's a book that's sort of Alex's version of setting the record straight, because we've heard Sammy's version. Sammy, maybe 10 years ago or so, wrote a book all about his life, and obviously Van Halen is a big part of it. And Eddie, and particularly Alex, I think, never really forgave him for talking about the only time in their history when they really didn't get along. And that was this 2004 reunion tour, which was just a disaster because Eddie wasn't really feeling it. He was getting drunk all the time. He was going through cancer treatments or had gone through them before. And that tour was really the only bad Van Halen tour. Every other Van Halen tour, they played really well. And Sammy was very candid about it. Eddie did get back in touch with Sammy very shortly before Eddie died. Alex never did, and Alex and Sammy still do not speak. And Alex and Michael Anthony never speak, and that I don't know why, because Michael Anthony has never said a bad word about anyone. Could be because of his close friendship that he developed with Sammy, which is another great thing that came out of Van Halen. The fact that Sammy, a non-original member, and Mike, who was there, well, there was Mark Stone, but let's call Michael an original member. Come on. That they developed such a great musical friendship that is really now what is keeping, at least in the live arena, it's what's keeping the Van Halen music that we all know and love alive. And so that there is the drama, as any great story in music has, but it really is the music itself. And I was thinking, should I rank my albums, my Van Halen albums in my order of favorites? I thought they're really all good. Yeah, Van Halen 3, we all know. And maybe the one that they did with Roth at the very end, A Different Kind of Truth. But, all of the albums from that classic period, from Van Halen 1 through Balance in 1995, that's a pretty big run to have, 1978 to 1995. And every single album they put out between those years was a winner. And at one point in their early years, they were putting out an album almost once a year. Van Halen 1 came out in 78, Van Halen 2 came out in 79, Women and Children First in 1980. Fair Warning in 1981. So they were really churning them out. And to keep things so fresh and so high quality when you're churning them out that quickly. And then Diver Down, not they tried to take a break, but that didn't work. So they had to go back and do Diver Down. And then they recorded 1984 and 1983. The album was released in early 1984. So they really didn't have a break. And then just as soon as you could say, where's the singer gone? 86. They got 5150, and then they slowed to what by that point in the music world was more of a normal pace, but still putting out absolutely excellent albums. So the longevity of the group in terms of quality is something that I think is to be commended. Not every band, even that has 3, even that has 4 great albums, can put out that many good albums so consistently over the years and be one of the best ever live albums. And that's why I really hope they release more live material. Thankfully, on an official basis, they just released the free Dallas concert from, I think, was it 91 or 92, around that time. That was widely circulating as a bootleg, but they finally released an official version of that. I hope they release an official version on modern streaming sources and the rest of it of Live Without a Net from the 5150 tour, because that was not only shot on film, 35 millimeter film, the performance was perfect, as was a pro shot TV video from 89, the OU812 tour in Japan, the band sounding absolutely wonderful. So if we could just get those 2 videos alone re-released professionally, for scale it up to 4K, in terms of, well, you don't need to scale it up, just the 35 millimeter, just transfer it to 4K, scale up the video from 1989, and you've got some really good stuff that I think everyone would enjoy. It's really hard to say my best memory of Van Halen, because Van Halen was the kind of music that people made memories to. People remember where they were when they heard a certain song for the first time or when they heard it for the 100th time. There's something about Van Halen that's just inexplicably memorable. Again, another sign that Eddie was an amazing songwriter, a fantastically good songwriter. And so, with that, if I were you, I would just listen, listen, listen. Spend the day on this Sunday listening to all of the Van Halen albums. You cannot go wrong. And just relive all over again just how good they were. And there were so many great musicians in every genre and so many great bands in every genre. But if I was asked point blank, name me one, mind you, only one band that was the quintessential rock band, I think I would have to say Van Halen. And yes, there's a lot of great competition, but if there was one band that really symbolized everything about good rock music, that would be Van Halen. Let me know if you disagree. Rest in peace, Eddie Van Halen. All of my love, for what it's worth, to Alex and Wolf. It's not easy being in a family band when the leader of that band goes away too early. But we've still got the music. That, I guess, is what counts. Like and subscribe to this, and we will see you next time. Take care, and long live Eddie Van Halen.